Welcome to today's Hinckley Forum. My name is Rory Stewart, and I will be the forum host for today's conversation. The Hinckley Institute of Politics is a nonpartisan institute at the University of Utah. The Hinckley provides an array of transformative experiences for students through internships, forums, and classes. Hinckley forums seek to foster public discourse and civil debate on the most current and pressing issues, bringing in local, national, and international thought leaders. This forum is titled Soldiers, Workers, and the History of Disability in World War II America and is presented as part of the University of Utah's Veteran Day programming. Note that pizza will be served at the end of today's event. We are excited to be joined by today's speaker, Professor Matt Basso. Matt Basso is an associate professor in the Department of History and Gender Studies at the University of Utah. His researches primarily are in primarily three areas: the relationship between war and society, labor and working class history, and the theory and history of masculinity. His scholarship appears in both traditional venues such as books and articles and in community-focused projects, including the creation of digital archives and museum exhibits, the development of oral history initiatives, and the production of K through 12 curriculum materials and research reports for government entities. His teaching encompasses these research areas as well as U.S. and Pacific history more broadly, along with the methods of public history. Basso's most recent publication is World War II and the American Homefront, Volume 2, published by the National Park Service, which explores environmental, Native American, Indigenous, Latino, LGBTQ, and disability histories of the Homefront. Much of his work incorporates student training, including a major project for the National Park Service in partnership with the National Council on Public History, focused on World War II Homefront, which World War II and the American Homefront Volume 2 was one of three components. We look forward to learning more about a part of this project today. Please join me in welcoming our guest.
For being here, Rory, thank you very much. Looks like you'll hear me at various versions of loudness, I think. I want to thank the Veterans Day Committee for the invitation to speak, and the Hinckley Forum, of course, especially Nick Cockrell for organizing and hosting the talk. I also want to acknowledge those who I served with, including my twin brother, those who served and have passed on, including my parents, and veterans in the audience today, including some that are with us via video feed. So this marks the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II. World War II is, of course, America's good war, and it's the 20th century conflict that has come closest to being a total mobilization for the United States. Reflective of this, we tend to talk about the cohort of Americans that were active during World War II as the greatest generation. Indeed, it was not unusual to describe not just soldiers, but home front workers as, in their case, soldiers of production. And many in both groups paid the ultimate price, which I'll say more about here in a moment. Many others were disabled during the war, and that's the focus of my comments. So in recognition of their service, I want to tell that wartime story, the wartime story of Americans on the home front. You see two photos here. You see a photo of two disabled military men who will, of course, become veterans. This is at Bushnell Military Hospital in Brigham City. I'll talk more about Bushnell a little later. The second is a photo of the Geneva Steelworks. Some of you will know that the Geneva Steelworks were positioned just on Utah Lake, down in Vineyard. Very, very significant wartime production site. I'm going to speak again about that site as well. So my comments, as already noted, are based off of this long 5-year project with the National Park Service that I did with about 17 of our students, graduate students and undergraduates. The World War II Homefront volume that I'll be commenting on is work that I did with some student research support. Here you also see not just a picture of the cover of that report, which is freely available, by the way, for anyone interested in any of those chapters, but also the emblem for the World War II Heritage Cities program. This was an initiative of the US Congress back when it used to work. And the idea here was for every state in the Union to have a heritage city that very much told that World War II story, especially the home front story. Our students here at the University of Utah did 55 short home front histories, one for every state and territory. A really pretty remarkable effort. The National Park Service is working now to make those a little shorter. They're about 4,000 words, make them about 1,000 words and publish them. So I'm really excited by that. Both of these projects are place-based histories. That is to say that the National Park Service has a real interest in serving not just public historians, but the broader public who are interested in properties, who are interested in our built environment, and also in our landscapes. This theme study provides thematic background for public historians to make claims for the significance of sites and properties around the US to be recognized either as National Historic Landmarks or with the National Register of Historic Places program. They also, these theme studies, help us really evaluate which properties are significant enough for these quite laudable and rare recognitions. So to do that, we look at two things. One, the historical significance of a property, but secondly, its integrity. By integrity, public historians mean, does the building or the place still look in many ways like it did during the moment of its national significance? In this case, it's the World War II home front, but of course, this is the case for the Civil War or the Revolutionary War or so on. A lot of my comments are going to be around this theme, at least in the background of significance and integrity, vis-a-vis this new theme that comes forward in this volume that I finished, and it's the theme of disability. It's an emerging area of historical research and humanities research, and I'll explain what I mean by that here in a couple of moments. I do want to note that it's based not just on my research, but also on my reading of really an astonishing set of fantastic disability studies scholars. All right. Sorry, I have to do this. The university contractually obligates me to advertise my courses. If you end up being interested in this methodology, if you like the idea of working on real-world projects, the history department, me, is offering a new public history course next semester called Public History in Practice. We're going to be working on two projects in particular, real-world projects. One is the next phase of this project, of this World War II Homefront project, and we'll be focusing on a particular site around the Zoot Suit riots, and we'll be nominating it for a National Historic Landmark status. Secondly, we're going to be working for the Lehigh Historical Society. Anybody from Lehigh? Oh, man. So Lehigh's got a fantastic historical society, and they're doing a historic markers program, which means if you end up in this class, you both learn a set of skills, you learn from the state's best public historians who are going to come in and chat with us. We'll do a couple of field trips, including down to Topaz, extraordinarily important part of the Utah home front. And finally, you'll get to put stuff on your transcript and learn how to work collaboratively and how to do specific kinds of research around properties and other things. If you have questions about this class, I'm happy to answer it in the Q&A. Look, did you see that I actually put your registration information on here? Okay, I've yet to see a single person taking notes, so I'm assuming you've got like a photographic memory or something and that you'll all be registering. All right, let's get into this. I want to tell you the disability history of the World War II Homefront through three sites in particular. One of them, the White House. Secondly, factories. So this isn't a particular site that will kind of zero in on Geneva Steelworks. And third, hospitals broadly, and we'll focus on Brigham City in particular. There's some key takeaways here that I want you to know, and I've listed those on the slide here. More than 10 million Americans became temporarily or permanently disabled through military and workplace injuries during World War II. Let me say that to you again. More than 10 million Americans became either permanently or temporarily disabled during World War II. This is an astonishing statistic, and I think really reinforces why this approach to our home front history is so important, so fundamental to tell the story of all Americans through these varied lenses. Organizations that focused on improving the lives of both those that were disabled during the war grew, and new organizations were founded during the war. That's a second key reason for thinking through the disability history of the home front. These developments and the need for disabled people to participate in the labor force increased attention on those with intellectual, sensory, and physical disabilities. The result was an array of new government and business policies. This is fundamentally important to the history after World War II as well. The prominence of the home front in that history can't be undersold. Here you see a photograph of some disabled folks going through a test evaluation to figure out what kind of work they can do on the home front. I want to start, though, with the most famous disabled person on the World War II home front, and that's this man. I've cheated. I want to talk about the Southern White House more than I want to talk about the actual White House. This is a photograph of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the most important American, not just the most important disabled American, during this long period from the Great Depression through World War II. Here he's at Warm Springs, Georgia, which is a site that he purchased, a site on the Warm Springs, and then built into a polio treatment center. Some of you will know that President Roosevelt had polio, and this is a big part of the American story of disability during this era. Myth has it that Roosevelt did not want to be pictured as a disabled man, that it wasn't the strong presence that he thought was important for the nation, both during the Great Depression and World War II. In fact, more recent research, and these are panels, museum exhibit panels from the FDR Home and Library in Hyde Park, New York, suggest that that story needs to be complicated. By the way, panels like this are exactly the kind of work we'll be doing in the public history and practice class. This panel suggests that FDR, and you can read along with me if you wish, regularly used leg braces, canes, and customized speaker stands for public appearances. And here you see a photograph of one of those. As the crowd looked on, the president would approach a rostrum with his cane and the strong arm of an assistant. President Roosevelt was extraordinarily strong. Then, grabbing the rails at the rear of the rostrum, he used his upper body strength to move forward towards the podium. Corrective walking, as it was called at Warm Springs, was a vital part of the post-polio therapy, and this was the use of braces to help people with polio move around. But was this an effort to hide disability? Was he really trying to hide disability? And what does that mean for our understanding of the experience of disabled Americans during World War II? This set of images from Hyde Park suggests that he was in fact a more public face of disability, that he in fact did not mind being pictured as being associated with disability. Here's a quote from him as he spoke about this on the world stage. "After all, what is the difference? What does it matter if you or I walk with a limp or have something wrong with an arm? That is a small thing in any life." Okay, this is when he's actually running for the presidency in 1931. Warm Springs helps us see another part of the World War II home front disability history story. So Warm Springs itself was a site that we might talk about now as being designed along universal design or universal access principles. You can see here FDR using a special staircase he had installed. You can see him with an automobile that's been modified for his own use. However, Warm Springs was not open to all disabled Americans. It's absolutely critical to underscore this point. This was a community where disabled Americans were able to come together, but not all were invited. This was a group of elite disabled that gathered at Warm Springs. For example, Black Americans were only welcome at Warm Springs through to nearly the end of World War II as staff, okay, as folks that worked there. In addition, the Works Progress Administration, one of FDR's most famous pre-war initiatives, refused to employ disabled folks on relief work, prompting, as the really incredible research of Paul Longmore, among others, have shown, the establishment of the League for the Physically Handicapped, which conducted one of the first significant disability rights protests in the 1930s. It's essential to remember that change only happens through the activism of disabled Americans, including during World War II. If we're going to talk about the government and its relationship to disability during World War II, and we're soon going to get to that story for veterans and workers, the first thing we need to understand is that the idea of bodily ability coursed throughout American home front culture, especially through the draft. The Selective Service System evaluated American men through a very large age range, and those men were told whether they were able-bodied or not able-bodied. An extraordinary number, especially in the first years of the war, were deemed unfit for military service, either because of physical or mental disabilities. There is no question that the Selective Service System put on people's minds the question of bodily ability. This begins, by the way, in October 1940, during the first peacetime draft in US history, when an extraordinary number of men were evaluated. This was the first of these long-running wartime evaluations. Happy to talk more about this during the Q&A if you're interested. It also is in this theme study that I'm basing my comments off of. Okay, if we're going to focus in on disabled veterans and disabled civilians, we need to talk about two pieces of legislation, and it feels fitting being here at the Hinckley to talk about legislation and politics in a more formal manner. This is Public Law 16, which was passed in March of 1943. That's a law for veterans about rehabilitation in particular and the treatment of disability. And secondly, the Vocational Rehabilitation Act, which is for civilians, in July of 1943. In December of 1941, Roosevelt meets with Paul McNutt, then the head of the Federal Security Agency, which oversaw Social Security, education, public health, and other things, and asked him to create a program that would help get physically disabled civilians and military veterans into the wartime workforce. And again, here you see a rehabilitation workshop. The need was obvious, both because it was clear that America was going to need more workers, and secondly, because of the experience of World War I veterans, it was clear that World War II veterans that were disabled during service were going to need rehabilitation services, right? So these laws were meant to address that. You will note, 1941, this is raised. It's not until the middle of 1943 that this legislation is passed. Well, some people have suggested that the blame falls on conservatives who were frustrated by Roosevelt's New Deal programs. In fact, this was fighting between different wings of the Roosevelt administration, primarily the Veterans Administration or folks associated with the Veterans Administration who championed the position of veterans organizations. Those veterans organizations did not believe that veterans rehabilitation should be merged with civilian rehabilitation, and that's because they believed that veterans deserved more and better. This is one of the long-running fissures in the United States over rehabilitation and over services to disabled Americans. Finally, 18 months later, the veterans win. That's why this law is split into two different pieces. Disabled civilian advocacy groups, most especially the National Association of the Deaf, the National Federation of the Blind, and the group that's pictured here, the American Federation of the Physically Handicapped, were extraordinarily frustrated by both this effort on the part of Veterans Administration groups and also the slowness of these rehabilitation services. The AFPH, founded by a man named Paul Strahan, who was disabled in 1929 in a car accident, believed that mobilizing the collective power of a wide variety of disabled individuals was critical to a future that treated disabled Americans much better. He argued that, quote, the blind, deaf, hard of hearing, those who have cardiac conditions, those with tuberculosis, arthritis, epileptics, those with polio, those with cerebral palsy, amputees, and diabetics should work together. That this inclusive model of disability activism, in his mind, had the best chance of catalyzing significant change, was in fact reflected in the massive growth of this organization during World War II and its activism. And again, here you see one symbol of that. While this was a split from veterans groups that I noted earlier in this legislation, it's also worth noting that the Paul Strahan and these other groups did in fact work with veterans organizations during the war, right? To push a rehabilitation mindset and to push better policies for both veterans and civilians. The primary organizations are ones that you might still know for veterans. That's the American Legion, the Veterans of Foreign Wars, and the Disabled Veterans of America. They emphasizes the plight of former soldiers, but they did also talk about the need to work for disabled Americans more broadly. And I'm happy to talk about the history, especially the World War I history of some of these organizations during the Q&A. Okay, that's a quick legislative snapshot, starting with Roosevelt and talking about these key pieces of legislation and suggesting the importance of civilian and veteran activism in regard to legislation during World War II. The second site I want to go to is the factory. And here I've got a photograph up of, in fact, Geneva Steel, which is right there on Utah Lake. And I've got a propaganda poster up, which suggests even the visual importance of questions about injury and disability during the war. During the fight over vocational rehabilitation legislation, even during that year and a half, the number of civilian workers disabled on the home front grew dramatically. Workplace injuries, long a scourge of American industry, had in fact fallen in the latter years of the Great Depression. But the pattern changed in 1942 and 1943 as new factory workers received substandard training and factories failed to focus enough on safety. Death and injury statistics show that through 1943, this is an important point, through 1943, home front workers were in more danger than armed forces personnel. That is not a misstatement. The number of injuries and deaths on the home front through 1943 is truly remarkable as the arsenal of democracy gears up and as new workers enter workplaces that they're not used to. Death and injury statistics included folks here at Geneva Steel men like Laren Rasmussen from Castledale, who died at Geneva Steel during the war, and also men who were injured, like pipefitter Jay Perry, who also suffered a catastrophic injury at Geneva Steel. This is all from newspaper accounts and other primary sources that really have yet to be fully mined. The story of disability in Utah on the World War home front is one that is much more ripe for telling. Driven by this development, organized labor became one of the primary partners in pushing for rehabilitation and through stronger safety in the workplace. And we see that also at Geneva Steel, where unions there pushed for one of the most important pieces of wartime policy and legislation in Utah vis-a-vis disability. This is a famous photograph of a little person working in war production during World War II. This is courtesy of FDR's Presidential Library. The desire, and I want to stress, the financial need of newly disabled and disabled folks who had been long disabled in the United States to get into the workplace found an echo of what had been the experience of people that were disabled before the war. For this latter group, the war was transformative in a different way. It finally offered rehabilitation services, and more importantly, it opened job opportunities that had long been closed to them. So this is then a story of the World War II home front as a site of opportunity, right, for disabled Americans. Numbers tell this story regarding what rehabilitation and vocational training meant to disabled Americans on the home front. In 1940, the first year of wartime mobilization, and not incidentally of full employment, government agencies placed 28,000 disabled individuals in jobs. In 1945, they placed 300,000, a clear sign that both industry and the government were increasingly willing to employ disabled people in a range of jobs. Notably, the number of disabled people working on the home front was much higher. The New York Times estimated that 3 million disabled folks were working in 1942, adding, quote, "The number is constantly increasing as the able-bodied are called to the colors." Now, that does not mean that factories opened their arms to disabled workers. In truth, all sorts of wartime workplaces were slow in opening their doors to disabled workers. This is a still from a wartime film, you can find it on YouTube, that called Employing Disabled Workers in Industry, that was put out by the government. But the government itself was slow in allowing wartime workers into many of its facilities. They did, though, do some changes. So we see at Hill Air Force Base, at the Ogden Depot, and also at places like Geneva Steel that had government contracts, an effort to open more jobs. My argument is that it's just slow, far too slow in its efforts. When the War Department hired disabled workers, say for example at a place like Brookley Field in Alabama, which employed 17,000 civilians, it wasn't until 1943 that they were willing to take on 11 blind trainees. You can get a sense then of the ratio of workers that were allowed into these facilities. Aspects of a disabled American's identity, other aspects besides their disability, mattered in a profound way to their ability to gain this work. Men were far more likely, and white men in particular, to gain employment in these factories. Let me give you one example. John Millard, who had been rejected from jobs for 8 years prior to World War II because employees did not trust a man with, quote, artificial legs. He highlights the role of local and state agencies in providing employment, but he also highlights the gendered arguments put forward by those agencies and disability organizations. So in the case of Millard, the Cleveland Placement Bureau helped him land a job on an assembly line and he quickly earned the reputation as an efficient workman. The company added 5 other handicapped workers soon afterwards. The Bureau noted that this job allowed him to once again fulfill his responsibilities as a breadwinner to his wife and 6 children. As the fantastic historian Sarah Rose and other scholars have asserted, an individual's experience of disability was deeply intersectional. That is, again, to remind you, it depended on what other aspects of their identity were. Disabled women had more challenges, much like other women did, in entering the World War II workforce, but they did succeed in some places. Mary Curtis, a former student at Gallaudet College, the country's foremost institution of higher education for deaf and hard of hearing people, found clerical work at the Pentagon. After that, she helped construct fuselages for B-29 bombers. Suggesting the way disabled people have been erased from homefront narratives, Curtis told an interviewer in an oral history well after the war, quote, "It's not in the history books, but I'm the deaf Rosie," end quote. Many deaf and hard of hearing women would have contested this claim. As Sarah Pawlicki's research on the Milwaukee Ordnance Plant shows, and the research of many other places, including an extraordinary community of deaf and hard of hearing workers in Toledo who worked in rubber factories. That Toledo plant is such a fascinating story, it is now gone. This is that question of preserving sites and telling the history of places and properties that I mentioned earlier. It's difficult, of course, to make a National Historic Landmark when the landmark is no longer there. That's why it's so urgent for us to protect all sorts of histories, to recognize histories on the home front and of the home front, as well as many other places. Disabled Americans and the story of race is also a less heartening story, much like the case with women. So white disabled folks had a better chance of getting work in factories and facilities. In the fall of 1944, Helen Keller, for instance, spoke to Congress, urging them to address the discriminatory education that deaf and blind students who were black were receiving in the United States. This education was fundamental to their ability then to move into war work and higher paying jobs. In so doing, though, it's critical to note she built off of a long critique put forward over decades by the black community regarding educational opportunities for all black children with disabilities, and they did so in places like the Journal of Negro Education and other sites. These histories are also needing to be told much more broadly. Disabled Japanese Americans received substandard support from the US government. When the removal order was initially made, disabled Japanese Americans were exempt, but as historian Selena Moon's research has shown, the government soon ordered all but those whose disabilities were so severe they could not be cared for in camp to leave the West Coast for incarceration camps. Some disabled incarcerees found work in the camps. Ted Shimano, for example, although blind, worked in the Minidoka carpentry shop as a furniture sander. Shimano was also several blind incarcerees who taught Braille in the camps. We have our own stories here in Topaz that are deeply important to this recovered history of home front disability history. I want to finally shift to the hospital in this last portion of my comments. As the war hit its later stages, disabled military men became the focus of home front efforts to grapple with disability. By mid-1944, 200,000 discharged veterans had been approved for disability pensions. More than 5% were assessed as totally disabled. Combat intensified from D-Day, which increased this number dramatically. By the time Japan surrendered, 678,000 US soldiers, sailors, and airmen and Marines had been wounded or injured. Of these, 44% had to be hospitalized and receive convalescent treatment. Convalescent treatment occurred in two places. This is not a designation that many Americans know anymore. If you were still in the military and you suffered these injuries, which of course was always the case, the first place you went to was a military rehabilitation hospital, either overseas or in the United States. Given what war had done to bodies in previous conflicts, both the military and the VA knew that they were going to run out of capacity to treat patients unless they moved quickly. The military was on a tighter clock and they responded creatively. Here you see a US Naval ward at Yosemite National Park in 1943. So the military repurposed sites, hotels, national park facilities all over the country, as well as purchasing civilian hospitals and rehabilitation sites. They also expanded their own facilities. This is Bethesda Naval Hospital, which most of you will know by the name Walter Reed, one of the most important hospitals in the US military and veteran system. As they did so, as they purchased new sites, they also relied on older sites. And so, for example, this is a photograph. Sorry, I had a photograph of Percy Jones on here, but I switched it out. This is a photograph of one of the new facilities they built. This is Bushnell General Military Hospital in Brigham City, built extraordinarily quickly, starting in 1942, with workers housed all through Brigham City in homes. Bushnell Military was a 235-acre facility, which cost $9 million, consisted of 60 buildings, and could house upwards of 3,000 patients. Approximately 12,000 military men were hospitalized at Bushnell, including members of the 442nd Combat Regiment, which many of you will know was the Japanese-American Combat Regiment. The first slide of this presentation pictured two of those men, if you didn't recognize that they were Japanese-American military men. Bushnell was known as a site for amputations, and those men that you saw in that early photograph were in fact at the amputation center at Bushnell. A number of remarkable oral histories tell us the story of Bushnell, including the treatment of neuropsychiatric patients, which I want to say more about. Those neuropsychiatric patients were treated in military facilities like Bushnell until they were transferred to Veterans Administration hospitals. The one with all the, on the hillside there is just over here. Okay, that is now a set of condominiums. That is up in the avenues on 12th Avenue. That was the Salt Lake VA. It had room for approximately 150 patients, and the VA knew that it was going to have to grow. It started building another facility there, but it was certainly not going to be big enough. I will talk about what replaced it, which is the Fort Douglas Military Hospital, here in a moment. This is also a picture of another VA facility. This is Detroit's Allen Park VA Hospital. So, expecting this substantial demand, the VA quickly started to build new facilities. There's a really interesting architectural history to be told about these, and I'm happy to talk more about those. The growth was especially exponential after the war under General Omar Bradley, which under Bradley, the VA rolled out third-generation hospitals, which were far less pastoral, which had been in the past, that is in the countryside, and much more in cities, which is one of the reasons that we have a big VA here. The VA built during this period, this post-war period, 183 new hospitals. 183 new hospitals, a really extraordinary effort. All right, a lot of these hospitals were focused on neuropsychiatric care. Veteran psychiatric care was extraordinarily important. Of approximately 800,000 US soldiers who saw intense combat during World War II, the military admitted 74% for psychiatric care. So 800,000 US soldiers, who saw intense combat during World War II, the military admits 74% of those men for psychiatric care. 37.5% of them had such serious trauma that they could no longer effectively function in military operations. In total, 1 million men faced debilitating psychiatric symptoms during World War II. Many proved the fallacy of the predisposition theory, which led large numbers being rejected during conscription medical exams. Right? You remember these medical exams? They would ask you questions to try to figure out if they felt you were fragile or something like this, and they thought you had a predisposition to neuropsychiatric problems. That was not the case. It was combat. Combat did this to men, not other things. And there's a lot of interesting psychological and psychiatric history around this story. So veteran psychiatric care was one of the foremost things that our own new VA hospital, which gets finished in 1952, up on Fort Douglas. You know where it is now. That used to be Fort Douglas, which gets named the George E. Wayland VA Medical Center. A quick moment to talk about George E. Wayland. I see lots of ROTC folks in the crowd and some veterans. This is a story you should know. I've put a website address up here. If I was fancier, I would do a QR code. George Wayland was a man from Ogden who wanted to be an Air Force mechanic and dropped out of high school, went into technical school to become a mechanic, and then in 1942, when he was finally old enough, enlisted into the military, but was told they didn't need Air Force mechanics. Surprising. And he was ended up being a Navy corpsman, so a medical assistant for the Navy. George Wayland ends up on Iwo Jima, and in a truly remarkable week or so of combat, saves an extraordinary number of men, and also is wounded multiple times himself. It's an astonishing story. For this, he receives the Navy Cross and then the Congressional Medal of Honor. Now I have to make a slight joke. George Wayland also smarted up and left the Navy and joined the Army. Sorry. So he ends up being a major in the U.S. Army as a career after World War II, but an astonishing Utahn, one that we should know, and also the namesake of one of the major medical centers in the Mountain West, our own medical center, which I want to emphasize, worked with disabled veterans, worked on rehabilitation for disabled veterans, and worked on neuropsychiatric care for veterans. They were assisted by our own university. The University of Utah was one of the first places to integrate veterans rehabilitation and civilian rehabilitation together, which is a remarkable and important story. And they did that during the war to, I think, our great honor. So part of this story involves our own university. I do not want to convince you that this is a story just of progress, of things getting better. The treatment of folks with mental disabilities in the United States in the 20th century is shocking and horrific. World War II was no different. In fact, World War II was one of the lowest points for the treatment by Americans of fellow Americans who had neuropsychiatric problems and disabilities. This is all laid out in a set of exposés and really important scholarship, including this piece here, Bedlam 1946, which ran in Life magazine, and which attention was shined on because of Americans' deep concerns about veterans and neuropsychiatric care, they started looking in other places. They started trying to figure out what was going on for civilians, and they saw the deeply horrific staffing of mental disability facilities and so on, and what scholars, disability studies scholars, call warehousing. That is simply packing people into places that no one should have to be in our nation's facilities. It's a horrific story and a reminder of the importance that we need to place on continuing to reform and revolutionize the way that we treat disability. No single text reminds us of the importance of this more than The Best Years of Our Lives, an extraordinarily important 1946 film that starred Harold Russell, a disabled veteran, who, by the way, was disabled on the home front in a training accident, right? Harold Russell in this film lays out both the experience of physical disability and alludes to the experience of mental disability, which is something that an extraordinary number of veterans faced in the post-war. He noted this as he continued to fight for both veterans and for civilians who were disabled Americans in the post-war. And by the 50s, he was warning that Americans, just as they had forgotten after World War I about their fellow disabled citizens, were doing the same after World War II. That's a warning to us too, right? To remember the importance of this topic, which I hope I've laid out in some detail, but not nearly enough. I want to thank you for your attention. This is, by the way, a World War II poster that I put at the end of my theme study. This poster by our fellow Americans warns about the foreclosing of knowledge, the banning of books, the censorship of information. And it was a fight against fascism that brought this to the fore for them. I dedicated that page to the National Park Service, which has had to change its presentation of history based on political realities of this moment. Just another thing that we should be cognizant of on this Veterans Day, the 80th anniversary, right, of World War II and of the end of our ancestors' fight against fascism. Thank you.
If anyone has questions, raise your hand and I'll pass the mic over to you.
Hi. So I think my question is, I read an article about how sometimes medical advancements in the battlefield, even though we have really good technology in the home front, that doesn't get translated to what we put in the battlefield that happened in World War II and has happened throughout American history. I think my question here is, a lot of the presentations focus on rehabilitation, but do you think there is also progress to be made on how we prevent, not only like how we prevent casualties happening in the first place, and if that's a place that we should also like, I guess, put emphasis on?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Thank you very much. Technology is an extraordinary, medical technology, a really important part of all of our war stories and about the story of disability. The World War I veterans who were one of the major forces in fighting against the US entry into World War II did so because so many of their compatriots had died, but the ones who had been saved had pretty catastrophic injuries, right? Those that tendency, the ability to save men on the battlefield, as you noted, increased dramatically during World War II, but it meant that there was more. We saved these men, but they had many more men who were injured during the war that were able to be saved, which, yes, we need to continue to advance our medical life-saving capabilities, but it also means that we have to advance as a society in regard to how we treat disabled folks, whether they're veterans or not, right? Flat out, all sorts of people get disabled during war, and we have to change as a society to be able to create a world that's easier for everyone to live in. Yeah, so yes, thank you for that. I appreciate it.
You mentioned bringing up the screening process again.
Yeah.
I'm thinking, well, you know my interests, U.S., Utah, LGBT history. Margot Canada's talked about that screening process and trying to identify or discover homosexuality in the body, looking at measuring body parts, looking for certain things. But I don't think it was framed as a disability. I'm wondering if you could maybe talk more about what they were looking for, and then, of course, my bias with homosexuality trying to be rooted out in that process.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I should say, both in regard to disability and LGBTQ history, the theme study lays out that story much more fully. For queer folks, where they got caught up wasn't I know Margot talks about kind of physical disability and measurements and so on, but was in the neuropsychiatric exams, right? And this history is an important history because it actually continues to shape the treatment and evaluation of queer folks after the war, too. This set of questions about whether you are an effective or whether you'd be effective in the military. Some of you might know all sorts of LGBTQ folks fought with incredible capability during World War II and were welcomed by their units kind of until the end of the war, when there is, as moments of combat and greater intensity of fighting occurred, we needed more fighters. Towards the end, when we started to draw that down, then people started looking to say, wait a minute, maybe I don't like this person because they're attracted to people I'm not attracted to, or whatever it might be. So it was the neuropsychiatric exams that most often caught out queer folks in conscription.
Great talk. Thanks
Thanks,
Dr.
Leslie.
Basso. I have a two-part question.
Yeah.
One is, I was really struck by that staggering quote about 80% of people with neuropsych disabilities and 37% unable to perform the duties of military life, right? So I'm wondering if you can talk about like the rehabilitation of white masculinity through labor.
Yeah.
And some of those images, so many of them are white men with physical disabilities too, right?
Yeah.
There's no way to display neuropsych disabilities,
Yeah.
but I'm guessing that at least that 40% was also not able to function in regular life, let alone military life, and maybe the rest of the 80%, right? And part two, I'm just curious about I'm just noticing the absence of like the feminist ethic and rubric of care. From all of this whole story. Like, what happens for those of us who will never be rehabilitated? And for those of us who never were able to perform labor for the capitalist machine?
Excellent questions. So in the case of men that were disabled in combat, neuropsychiatric disability, we talk about the 80% of men who were temporarily disabled from being able to go back into combat, and then the 47 or so percent, 37, I can't remember, who were permanently in that case. Remarkably, our fellow Americans were kind of on it. I don't want to like blow this up too much, but there was a lot of talk at the end of World War II about what the war had done to men. And about the men who saw combat. So you saw story after story in the press, in magazines. You saw publications from the government, the VA, and others urging folks to understand that these men were changed and that we needed to change too, right? That we needed to have a different perspective on them. Did they nail it? No. Did they get everything right? No. But it's interesting that they were really aware and alert to this question of neuropsychiatric difference that the war caused. Now, as far more broadly for folks who had neuropsychiatric disabilities prior to the war, less so, though there was, as I noted, this focus on trying to more reform, not revolutionize, more reform hospitals, mental hospitals around the United States. For folks who were not going to be ideal cogs in the industrial workforce, there was efforts to try to find other kinds of work for them, but what there wasn't, and what Dr. Fry is alluding to, is kind of a sense of interdependence, of building communities where an ethic of care really was foregrounded. Surprisingly, we actually have history of doing this, right? There are, in fact, examples in our country of forming different kinds of communities and societies for folks who, aren't the perfect productive worker in an imagining of what that's supposed to be, but in fact can work with each other and create kind of a community of interdependence. Not dependence, but of interdependence. The most famous example of this is called the Rome Plan, which is an agricultural plan, interestingly enough. I can, again, if other folks are interested in this, I say more about it in the theme study, but this is all borrowed from the fantastic historian Sarah Rose, who talks about the Rome Plan. So that's only kind of a partial answer, but thank you for those questions.
Okay, this will be the last question.
Good afternoon, sir. Thank you
Yeah.
for educating
Yeah.
us. Regarding the mistreatment of psychiatric patients in mental hospitals with Bedlam 1946, when did we see a change, and has there been a change in focusing on the mental health piece, just like an amputee?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, right? So what we actually see are periods of change and then backsliding, unfortunately, right? And that's not very surprising to folks who know history. But just after the war, there really is this focus. One of the folks who sheds light on this focus, by the way, and I promise I won't go on too long, is Eleanor Roosevelt, but that's because she's championing an important set of exposés by conscientious objectors. This is an incredible story, right? Conscientious objectors, one of the duties that they could take during the war was to go to work in mental asylums. And it was conscientious objectors who in many instances exposed the problems in these hospitals, and in fact wrote a best-selling book collectively about this. It's really kind of an astonishing story. There are moments of reform afterwards, and they're often tied with war. So for instance, many of you will know after Vietnam, there's a real focus on PTSD, right? After Iraq and Afghanistan, there's been more of a focus on a wound that we call moral injury. And that's something that, again, I'm more than happy to say more about at a different point. But it's these waves of reform and effort. And then, again, we just have to caution and be worried about backsliding because we have to keep our attention on this. Again, both for veterans and for civilians who really need us to work on continuing to change our world for the better. Yeah. So thank you for that question. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Let's give one more round of applause to our guest speaker. Thank you guys for coming out today. Feel free to stick around. There's pizza outside. Take one slice for right now, but yeah, awesome. Thank you.